Why? Why can we only hold such a small amount of information?
Yes, I think that this is kind of the million-dollar question, Paul.
Yeah.
Why is there this limit? And I think that, there's a long history here and the history of the neuroscience of looking at short-term memory function. Um, about 50 years ago or so in the 70s, people started to find neural signals that would actually track the content of the information that an animal was holding in working memory, for example. Like if a monkey was holding a color in short-term memory, they could actually find cells in the inferotemporal cortex that would represent that color during that delay period. And there was kind of this real excitement about this type of observation because it seemed like neuroscientists were able to be looking at the memories as they were being held online in this neural activity. And so this really inspired a lot of theories of working memory limits that focus on limits in those brain regions that are representing the information of interest. So color selective neurons in the visual cortex or face selective cells in inferotemporal cortex. Perhaps these are the places where these capacity limits are actually arising. But I will point out that Ed Vogel and I actually have a kind of different perspective on these
Okay.
capacity limits. And instead, we've kind of been focused on the idea of a limit in a process that is actually separate, a distinct facet of memory from the maintenance of specific pieces of content per se. And so if you'll give me a moment, I can try to
Please,
explain
go
what I'm
for it.
talking about here. So if you think about your everyday experience in life, almost every experience that you have is in a dynamic environment. Even just
Okay.
reaching out to pick up a coffee cup. Well, what you're having to do is track your fingers and your hand and the position of that cup simultaneously as you bring them together and then you lift it to your mouth and take a sip. And what we're realizing through kind of visual cognition and the philosophy of visual cognition is that this simple act of picking up an object or targeting an object, acting upon an object, even touching an object, requires you to be able to track that object through time and space. In other
Okay.
words, we would call this in more jargony terms, refer to this as context binding. How do you
Okay.
actually take an object that you're interested in and perceive it within the context of a dynamic event? And what we think we've been able to find is a neural signal that actually tracks the number of items that a person is currently binding to the event that they are perceiving. And so, for example, in that simple colored square memory task that I was just mentioning to you, if we vary the number of colors that a person is holding in working memory, we can see a sustained neural signal that will actually tell us how many individual colors are they able to hold in mind at one time.
Huh.
But a really fascinating thing about that neural signal is that it is general and does not seem to care too much about what the content is of the items that are being maintained in memory. So, for example, we in a recent paper found that if you look at the neural activity that tracks the number of colors that a person is holding in memory, we see that a very similar, if not identical, neural signal is generated when people are holding different numbers of sounds in working memory as
Okay.
well.